Good afternoon. Um, Welcome to the final webinar of the CalNew of the 2023-2024 CalNew series. I'm really happy to be here to greet you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shiloni Cruz Gonzalez, and I'm Deputy Director for Californians Together. And so, and really proud of the great work that we've been doing supporting newcomers since the launch of our support for immigrant and refugee student project about 7 years ago, but especially proud of the work that we've been able to do, led by Sam Finn, in partnership with the California Department of Social Services and the Department of Education and the 22 districts across the state who are really leading through the fact that they have large enrollments of asylum and refugee students and unaccompanied minors, but also leading because they have really built strong capacity to support their students. And we know that that capacity exists across districts in California and across the nation. So really happy that Californians Together is helping doing our little part to bring together some of the people that are doing amazing work in classrooms across the country. So I just want to do a quick welcome because we're so proud of this work and we're so proud that it's meeting a need in the field, and we hope to continue engaging with you. And especially just wanted to express our appreciation for the work that Sam Finn has done, really helping us lead and build out this work. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheilanine.
Mhm.
So I am Sam Finn. I'm the Director of Newcomer Policy and Practice at Californians Together, and I work with the California Newcomer Education and Wellbeing Program. The CalNew program, which is supporting this webinar, is a state grant program that supports socioeconomically disadvantaged newcomer students and their families using school sites as a service hub. And this is the last of our webinars in the series we've been doing this year, exploring the field of newcomer education. If you enjoy this one or have enjoyed others, we do have them all up on a website. Our real goal and hope with this 5 webinar series, which we'll hope to repeat next year, is just thinking about how we can bring some of our best and brightest scholars and practitioners and service providers to share their knowledge with all of us. And so a look at what those have been so far is right here with us. You can go to www.calnew.net, the California Newcomer Network's website, where these videos are hosted. We'll be adding in the resources associated with them over the summer. This webinar is being recorded. We'll send it out with affiliated resources right afterwards. So without further ado, what are we talking about today? We're really here to learn from some of the top recent writing and research on newcomer education going on. And so first, we're going to hear a little bit about some current best practices you might consider for newcomers and the history of how we got here over the last century. Then we're going to really hear a leading academic talk about how you can really map and conceptualize all the different facets of research that's going on for newcomer education and how they intersect. And finally, we're going to hear really one of the legends of the field talk about some new research that's going on in the national school climate for newcomer students. So let's go ahead and introduce our speakers and panelists today. First, we have Jessica Lander, a teacher of the year and author of Making Americans, one of my favorites here. Then we have Monisha Bajaj, professor at University of San Francisco, author of another one of my favorites. And then we have Carola Suarez Orozco, the director of the Harvard Immigration Initiative, who really needs no introduction in this space, such that she has written the blurbs on the back of both of these books. But she is an eminent psychologist who has studied the experience of immigrant youth and how that process shapes and changes them and how we can best support them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sam. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for all joining us. And I'm just really honored to be part of this really illustrious panel of folks that I have had the opportunity to learn from, both either in person or from their work over many years. I am excited to share a little bit, as Sam said, about the history and some of the best practice. And I'm just going to dive into it because we don't have that much time together. But first and foremost, I am a teacher. I teach and have the honor of teaching and learning with immigrant and refugee students from about 30 different countries in Lowell, Massachusetts. And my students come from all across the world, from Colombia to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Cambodia. I'm also the author of Making Americans, the book that Sam held up. And I'm going to be telling stories about some of the work that I've seen across the country and some of the history that I was learning about over the last 4 years. And then, as Sam mentioned, was honored to be named 2023 Massachusetts History Teacher of the Year. But I wanted to start with these pictures of my classroom because for me, that's where this work began. Being a teacher, seeing the work my students did, seeing the strengths my students brought to our classroom, to our community, the ways in which they were taking just such ownership of their learning and deeply engaging in the learning as they were creating new homes and new lives here, the ways in which they were supporting each other's learning, and then the ways in which they were taking that learning out into the community. Writing books, sharing their stories, sharing their histories, advocating for community change, and also then taking that nationally and working to support educators and young people to be able to share their voices to help create a deeper sense of belonging for young people across the country. And it was through all of this work that my students were doing that I was really struck by the strengths they brought to our classroom. Our immigrant origin students bring such an array of strengths to our classrooms. And for any educator on the call tonight, they'll know that firsthand. Our kiddos are linguistic and cultural navigators for our families. They bring tremendous grit and determination, honed having lived in multiple countries. They bring a wealth of knowledge, having lived in multiple countries and cultures, and they bring that all to our classrooms and to our communities. But one of the things that I've noticed as an educator is that our schools are not always set up to recognize, to invest in, and to value those strengths. And so one thing that really drove me to do this work looking nationally is how our schools and teachers across the country investing and valuing these strengths that our students bring. How are they setting up students for success? And then two, also, how can I be a better teacher? And so I set out from the classroom to learn this. And I realized pretty quickly on in setting out from the classroom that I needed 3 sets of stories if I wanted to help be part of the conversation around reimagining what it meant, reimagining immigrant education and what it meant to be doing immigrant education to best support our students. And for me, those 3 stories are laid out here. First, we need stories of the past. We need to understand the key laws, movements, and cases from the last 150 years that have transformed our schools in really powerful ways, but many of which these stories are not known. They're not taught. These are stories I did not know until I set out to do this work. And I'm going to tell you just a few of these in the next couple of minutes. The second is we need stories of the present. There is amazing, really creative innovation happening in schools from North Dakota to North Carolina. But similarly to those histories not being known, often these innovative school programs, these educators are not known outside of their community. There is a school that's 15 minutes away from me that's doing really remarkable work in investing in and collaborating with families of immigrant origin students. And I knew nothing about them until I started researching for what became this book. And I just imagined my younger self of how much more I could have learned if I knew about these amazing innovative programs right in my backyard, let alone in other states. And so how do we identify all of these programs, these practices, these educators so that we can learn from each other? And then finally, we need to learn from the personal. And for me as an educator, this is the heart of the work. We need to learn from our young people about their experiences, their journeys of coming to this country, and then their experiences of learning in this country. And I think if we are able to draw lessons from the past, the present, and the personal, we are going to be best set up to imagine what's possible in immigrant education. And together, and just briefly, because I want to dive into a few of these stories, together, what I've found is that this helps us best nurture that sense of belonging for our young immigrant origin students. And for the 3 of us on the call, we all have written about this. We've all talked about this, that the importance of belonging is fundamental for our kids. It's fundamental for all of us, but particularly for our young immigrant origin students who are creating new homes and new lives here. So how do we do that as schools, as educators? How do we nurture that sense of belonging for our young people? From what I've learned from looking at these stories of the past, the present, and the personal, it takes sort of 8 pillars, 8 sort of sets of ideas and approaches, and I'll present these to you now. I hope they resonate. But it takes opportunities for new beginnings and supportive communities, assurances of security and chances to dream, committed advocates, and recognition of those strengths and assets that I was talking about that drove me out of my classroom to go seek out knowledge across the country, acceptance for who our students are and where they come from, and opportunities for students to develop their voice and for us to be all valuing those voices. And so what I've been doing is looking at how these stories of the past, the present, and the personal help us better understand these 8 elements of belonging, and how that in turn can help us think about the policies, the practices, and the programs that can best reimagine schools to support our students. So that's a very brief overview. I wanted to dive into a little bit of history and a little bit of present day stories. I am a history teacher. I nerd out about this stuff, so I'm going to rein myself in. But I'm just like setting that out front that like this is, I love history. But I wanted to tell you a few stories of the past. So the first is the story of the Americanization movement. And I'm going to move quickly, and I'm happy to talk more at length later, but I want to get you a few of these. Um, this story is actually, it's personal to me because my great-grandfather Daniel, who's actually in this picture, the little boy, arrived as a 7-year-old in 1906 as a refugee from what is now Ukraine. He and his family had to flee his home during the pogroms in much of Eastern Europe, and he arrived in New York at the heart and the height of the Americanization movement. This time period in U.S. public schooling where there was a real focus on taking young immigrants and shaping them into a very narrow sense of what it meant to be American, but seeing that schools had a really important role to play. Now, it was a very narrow sense, so that when my great-grandfather Daniel in this picture arrived in New York, his language, his history, his culture, his religion were not wanted or welcome in most schools. And indeed, his sister, right there in that picture, who was 14 at the time, was denied an education because she had aged out of the system already. But an interesting part of this movement, and one person that I was really interested to study, was Julia Richmond, who was the first district superintendent of New York City Public Schools, who was both a woman and also the first Jewish district superintendent of New York City Public Schools. And she saw all these immigrants in her schools who were not being supported, who are either being denied access or who are not getting supports in a whole range of ways and dropping out. And she launched some of the first STEAMer classes, or sort of experimental classes in language and American culture, that these were going to be primer classes to help integrate immigrant origin students into public schools. And we see the sort of the modern day equivalents of that in English language classes, multilingual classes today. And so tracing those connections. We see it in schools like Las Americas in Houston, Texas. And so drawing those connections between the past and the present, which is a school for newcomer students new to the country less than a year. And I'm not going to go deeply into this, but they're doing really interesting work in trauma therapy supports and a trauma therapy approach to supporting kiddos, particularly those who are new to the country in their first year here, who are pretty young. The second story I wanted to briefly tell you about is the story of Meyer v. Nebraska, a parochial teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Nebraska who in 1920 is teaching his kids the Bible in German during recess. And for doing this, he is arrested because at the time in Nebraska, it was illegal to teach languages other than English. Indeed, in about half the states in the country, it was illegal to teach languages other than English. But Robert Meyer does not back down. And I think one of the things I find throughout the history I've had the opportunity to dive into is that at the heart of these laws, these cases, the movements are the courageous stories of individuals. And so Robert Meyer, being one of these courageous individuals, doesn't back down. And he takes his case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court comes back in favor of Robert Meyer, enshrining for the first time the right for students to learn and teachers to teach languages other than English. And then I found a really interesting connection in the work happening today in Leah Jolke's classroom in North Dakota. in the ways in which her class is advocating for the acceptance of her newcomer students, in the ways in which she saw that there was a real divide between her students who are new to the country and her students who they and their families have been in the country for generations. And so she created a class that was a partnership class that paired, let's call them old Dakotans and new Dakotans. And through a range of strategies and approaches in her curriculum, building connections, building bridges, and building empathy between students. And then our students actually go out into the community and are teaching others and advocating for inclusive practices and indeed at the state level, inclusive policies and laws. Let's go very briefly because we've got not too much time, but of course the story of Mendez v. Westminster that brings us out to California, which starts with the Mendez family returning to Westminster, California, and trying to enroll their kids in their dad's alma mater and being turned away, being told that your children have to go to the quote unquote Mexican school a mile away. And again, courageous individuals not backing down. The Mendezes don't back down, and so they organize with other families and they sue the schools. And this case goes up to the Ninth Circuit. It ultimately comes back in favor of the Mendezes, and then 2 months later, the governor of California desegregates schools across the state. And then 6 years later, the governor of California steps down and assumes a new position. Of course, he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the very first cases he hears is Brown v. Board of Education. And in the notes that Thurgood Marshall brings to the Supreme Court are the notes from the Mendez case, because they've been watching Mendez v. Westminster as a test case. There is, of course, Lau v. Nichols, also in California, of the case that the Supreme Court case that really enshrines the requirement that schools provide academic and linguistic supports to immigrant children, that you're not sinking or swimming kids and just hoping that they pick up the language naturally, that you actually have to provide language supports for kids. And the stories, again, of the many, many courageous individuals, from the lawyers to the activists to the parents to the teachers involved in this case. There's the story of Plyler v. Doe and the 4 families in Tyler, Texas, who risked immediate arrest and deportation to advocate for their children when their school district changed the policy and required $1,000 tuition for any student who could not prove legal residence. And their case and their courage leads to what we know as Plyler v. Doe, that Supreme Court case that enshrines the right for any kid access to the public K-12 education system, no matter their status. It leads to the Dreamer movement. And then, of course, after the DREAM Act fails and President Barack Obama creates DACA, it is announced on the 30th anniversary of Plyler v. Doe. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to throw in just one more school to bring it back to the present and thinking about acceptance. So pulling on the threads of Plyler and thinking about how our schools either are telling our kids that they are accepted for who they are or not. Today in the US, if you are a 16-year-old, say, refugee girl who's perhaps never had a chance at academic formal schooling, in much of the country, you're going to be put in 10th or 11th grade. Good luck. And what I found interesting about this particular school in the present, the Global Village Project in Georgia, is that this school recognizes that that is not a winning strategy for these young women, that they might need to start at a kindergarten level of education if they've never had a chance at academic formal schooling. But at the same time, they are mature young women who have likely shouldered the responsibilities of mature young women for many years, and you can't treat them like little kids. And so how do you create a curriculum and a school that honors both of those identities and sets them up for success both in this school, then in high school, and then in college, and then out in the community? And they're doing just really interesting work to really invest in the strengths and make sure that these particular group of kiddos feel accepted, where in many places they are feeling very unaccepted. I could go on. There are so many more stories here, but I will stop there and pass it over to my amazing co-panelists because they have so much to teach us. But I think what we find is just really interesting connections between the past and the present. And I think these stories have so many lessons for us for imagining what's possible and when we're thinking about reimagining immigrant education.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And if you refer to the chat, You will see some great resources there from Jessica, and I will go ahead and pass it off to Monisha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Jessica, for that fantastic presentation. I feel like your students are so lucky. I could sit and listen for hours to the historical. So fantastic. And your book is fantastic as well. I'm going to share a little bit today about research on newcomer education and a recent book that I co-authored to contribute to this growing field. And Jessica laid a foundation for some of the context historically. I just thought I'd share a few more statistics, getting into some of the terrain that we're working with here, especially in the United States and a little bit globally, because obviously the issue of newcomer, immigrant, refugee students, we can't disconnect from what's going on in the globe and the policies that are forcing people to cross borders, often implicated by the countries that they're coming to as well. So when we look at the current context of migration, about 281 million people have migrated from their country of birth. Across the United States, I think the number in the most recent census is about 14.4% of the population is foreign born. When you take states like California and New York, that goes up to about 30% of the state's population is foreign born. And 1 out of 4 people in the United States is an immigrant or the child of immigrants. Just 60% of ELLs graduate high school nationally in the US, and we don't, ELLs is not an exact proxy for newcomers, but the data isn't collected to give us that number clearly. And just to give you a sense, most of you on this call are educators or district leaders, you know this, but the top languages for newcomer students are Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Tagalog. So I want to talk a little bit about something, sorry, I skipped ahead a little too fast. I want to talk a little bit about what we know from the research and where the book project that I participated in that came out last year kind of fits into this larger context. And it's great to be on the call with Carola. Carola and Marcelo Suarez Orozco are the OGs in terms of the research in this field, decades of research that have really contributed to our understanding about newcomer students. We know that newcomer students are more likely to live in poverty. They're less likely to know about and access social services, and they're much more likely to drop out of school before the end of high school than their US-born peers. I myself am the child of immigrants, the grandchild of refugees, and I've had a long-standing interest in education for immigrant, refugee students, newcomers. When I was a doctoral student, I was an after-school educator for years at a high school for newcomers in the Bronx that served newcomer students primarily from Senegal, Guinea, the Dominican Republic, and Ecuador. And in 2014, when I came to the University of San Francisco, where I now teach, I used to teach at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. When I got here to the Bay Area with a team of graduate students, we started a collaborative research project with newcomer high school students in Oakland that led to new learnings for us and new insights about students' needs, their realities, and some of the really promising approaches that educators and schools were offering to catalyze academic attainment, school persistence, and socio-emotional well-being for the students in the schools. And this corresponded with the time where across the country, but especially here in the Bay Area, there was a surge in unaccompanied minors coming from Central America being placed with relatives here in the Bay Area. So as we were doing data collection, producing sort of academic articles and other pieces about the work, we were deciding whether or not to really think about producing a book based on this sort of multi-year project with data. And we did a little bit of a lay of the land. And, Jessica's wonderful book wasn't out yet, so apologies to you for not featuring it on this. Looking at the different books that were out there about newcomers and their realities, and we identified 3 broad categories where people were kind of producing resources for educators, for district leaders, for social service providers. And the first were research books that really documented longitudinal studies, ethnographic studies about different communities. And you can see some of the ones that we highlighted there in the upper, for me, it's the upper right. I don't know how it looks on your end. The second category were sort of nonfiction journalist accounts about the realities, kind of humanizing this population of students. And then the third were how-to books that really kind of got to like what strategies, what resources, what linguistic practices could be utilized to best serve this population. And we were thinking about trying to blend, and those of you who've read the book can tell us if we were successful or not, how to blend a little bit of these 3 different approaches into one book that could be really targeted for teachers as sort of a one-stop shop for where to get some strategies, get some real insights from where the research is at, and also be led to other resources and other communities that they could plug into to learn more. In thinking about this book, our impetus for it was seeing a need for something like this, especially as more and more teachers throughout the country who, very few teacher education programs have any courses on how to work with immigrant and refugee students, how to work with newcomers. I can't think of any state where it's required to take a course like this. It should be. And we were seeing, especially in Oakland, a lot of people were coming from different parts of the country, teachers from Kansas who had Afghan refugees resettled. They didn't know what to do, so they would fly out and make a trip and see what Oakland Unified was doing, because it's been seen as a district with a high number of newcomers, with really sort of welcoming practices in different places. But not every teacher or district can send their educators to go to another state and learn about it. So we wanted to document some of these promising practices, strategies in a book. And we ended up, because of COVID, bringing on many, many people to contribute to this, which I actually think became the book's greatest strength. We have 22 co-authors who are educators, researchers, former newcomer students themselves, giving advice back to educators and district leaders about what they would have liked when they arrived. And we're focused on grades 6 through 12 in this book. And in the book, we draw on research that has come before us to define 6 principles that base the 20 strategies that we present in the book. So we created an acronym for the framework for the book, drawing a lot on Carola and Marcelo's amazing work, looking at longitudinal studies with newcomers, as well as other scholars who've looked at translanguaging and other practices. In our framework for caring schools, the acronym stands for schools that are compassionate. A stands for achievement orientation, educators and staff holding high standards while acknowledging and valuing students' backgrounds. Relationships focused, I think this comes out of the book that I showed you on the previous slide, Carola's book, where they talk a lot about relationships and relational engagement, I think is the term that you all coined there, where educators and staff foster strong bonds among students and teachers, between families, communities, and schools, and among students themselves. The I stands for inclusive schools, inclusive in the broadest sense, thinking about diversity even among national groups. There's not a homogeneous culture among all students from Guatemala or Mexico or other places, really thinking about diversity in its broadest forms. Schools that are nurturing, schools that are genuine and constantly thinking about how to evolve, because of immigration flows, because of different things. You may have a different population than you did 3 years ago. And how do you as a school really think about what practices are needed with evolving and changing situations and populations? In our conceptualization of caring schools, many strategies emerged that offer students a chance to learn, thrive, and think about new possibilities that can truly transform their lives. And in the book, we focus on curricular, extracurricular, school-wide, and community engagement approaches to support newcomer integration and success. We used different criteria to look at which strategies to include. We could have had probably hundreds in there, but we wanted to look at those that addressed distinct cognitive, linguistic, cultural, sociopolitical realities, those strategies that help foster a school climate in which immigrant and refugee students can persist and thrive, those strategies that address the material, emotional, legal, and academic needs and realities of students and their families, those strategies that can increase students' abilities to deal with past, present, and potentially future trauma, strategies that can transcend the boundaries between schools and communities to create trust and belonging for immigrant students and their families, prepare those strategies that prepare students for post-secondary transitions and future life trajectories, and using innovative and humanizing ways of engaging families and communities. So I'll give you a little glimpse into the chapters that form the book. We have student profiles, we have school profiles, we have some definitions. We wanted any teacher who, may not have had exposure to some of the terms that get thrown around to really have an entry point into this book. And then different strategies for the classroom, such as translanguaging or differentiated instruction, strategies for school design in terms of staffing, school language policies, dual enrollment, and early college, and then strategies for extracurricular and community and alumni partnerships, such as schools that offer legal services on site, on campus, or have robust partnerships with community-based organizations. And then we profile a lot of schools that do a really good job of bringing in alumni as mentors, as tutors, as staff. Some of the schools have hired the principals, are alumni from newcomer schools or newcomer networks. And we feature 4 examples of schools from different parts of the country: Lincoln High School in Nebraska, the International High School at Prospect Heights in Brooklyn, Wellstone International High School in Minneapolis, and Redsdale Newcomer High School in Oakland, California, where myself and some of the authors from California have had a lot of contact with the amazing educators, students, and staff members there. I think I don't have enough time to go too much into the details. I wanted to give you an example, but I think I'll just move on to tell you a little bit about, well, I will tell you a little bit about Redsdale, since this is the California Newcomer Network. You may have already heard about them. They're the only continuation high school. I know on the East Coast, they say usually alternative high schools, but here in California, we call them continuation high schools. It's the only one focused on newcomer students, and they do some really creative work with having a later start time and a shorter school day than most schools. Most all the students are unaccompanied minors who have jobs after school in the back of restaurants or as part of nighttime office cleaning crews. And they do 6 weeks credit-bearing courses that allow students to take leaves of absence if necessary. They do year-round admission. They focus on social emotional learning. And there's just some really creative ways that they've thought about engaging students who are probably the most likely to drop out in other conventional schooling contexts. But in the interest of time, I will maybe tell you a little bit about our companion website as well, where we have curated resources for every chapter of the 20 strategies in the book. We also have a video playlist. We also have a book list for further information. Yeah, I want to say more, but I'm limited by time. But reach out to me or check out our website. We have lots of information there, and I will pass it on to Carola.
There we go. And I think you're on mute right now, Corolla.
Yes, I am. So I was saying, yes, I am on mute, and it's such an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with Manisha and Jessica, who are taking the work to the next level. So thank you so much, Sam, for organizing this. And I'm going to focus today on very new emerging research that has become my current obsession. So it aligns with very much many of the ideas that have been percolating for 30 years, but also that Jessica and Manisha have alluded to. And that's around the notion of school climate. So we know that schools are a primary site of acculturation and potential belonging. That is, any one of us who've done work in this field know that. It's the initial space of contact for newcomers. It's the first space of sustained contact between the family of origin culture and the host culture. And it's a potentializing space for educational attainment, of course, but also social belonging and cultivating civic and societal participation. So for so many reasons, schools have so much potential. And yet, any of us who have done work in the field, and I'm sorry, but Crystal, can you help me, because yes, the slides were not moving along as smoothly as I would have liked. Any of us who've done much work in the field, who have gone to multiple schools over time, know that there are very distinct climates of inclusion across schools. We can go to schools like Manisha has described, that are extremely responsive, and that Jessica has described, who have really been thoughtful and intentional and are extremely responsive to newcomer students. who create climates of inclusion, who have thoughtful programming, who are quite successful in the kinds of outcomes that we see. We see many more schools that I would call newcomer and immigrant oblivious. I would say the majority of schools are just, they haven't really consciously thought through what it takes to make the academic journey successful for newcomers. If they touch on it at all, they're obsessed with language learning. And that is certainly a piece of the equation, but it is not at all. Those of us who've done this for a long time know that's just a piece of the equation. And then there are schools, sadly, that are downright immigrant hostile. So that is something that I've become increasingly obsessed with over the years of doing this work, because, my original work in Learning a New Land, we started out in 50 schools. We ended up in 125 schools because immigrants move, newcomers in particular. And we began to see this phenomena. And the more time goes by, the more this is an issue, particularly because of the sociopolitical situation that we are in, that we find ourselves in recent years. There's work by John Rogers and his colleagues, as well as Patricia Gandara and her colleagues, where they have seen that xenophobia is cascading into schools. The sociopolitical climate of media and social media, and the political rhetoric of demonizing immigrants, along with toxic and unresolved racial climate. The two together is leading to social exclusion as a deep problem. And that's the thing that I've been really preoccupied about. Now, that pulling back in educational research, there's a lot of emerging work around school climate, as a recognition that school climate is important. It's something we should measure. It's something we should think about. It's something that we should move the needle on if we want to work on school improvement measures, or school improvement, work. So that's great. So I started thinking, okay, well, so let's look at school climate, and how does it, tap into the immigrant experience. So as I started to look at that literature, what I began to realize is a few things. First of all, immigrant kids are invisible in the standardized school climate measures. We did a review of the 26 school climate surveys that are approved by the U.S. Department of Education, the big ones like Panorama and Youth Truth and the many others, 26 of them, and none of them ask participants whether or not their parents are born in another country. It's a taboo topic. It's not touched upon. So we're not tapping in at all to what the immigrant student experience is like. We do, some of them look at English learners, some of them, only a couple, by the way, but that's a rough proxy. It's just a rough proxy of the immigrant experience. So that concerns me. Further, school climate measures school climate is kind of a messy concept. There are many ideas, there are many terms. They look at institutional environment and teaching and learning and relationships and safety and physical safety and psychological safety and bullying and school belonging. And when you start to look at it all, the field was really messy. So I with colleagues, including one of your colleagues at UC San Francisco, Juliana Carras, we started looking at the literature specifically around immigrant origin kids. And, we began to really look at what it means and why it matters. And, first of all, let's define it. School climate is really multifaceted. And it's about the collective experience of the quality of school life. And, it's a positive school climate is a product of schools' attention to fostering safety. If you think Maslow 101, basically, start with safety, promoting supportive academic, disciplinary, and physical environment, encouraging and maintaining respectful, trusting, and caring relationships. Many of the things that our two previous speakers have touched upon throughout the school community, and all of that, it leads to school success and positive youth outcomes. Okay, but that's still kind of messy. And then how do you test that? You know, how do you assess it systematically, and how do you test that? So just to keep going a tiny bit longer definitions, and then I'm going to show you some data. Why does it even matter? You know, and the evidence is pretty strong with populations other than immigrant origin students, that it matters for academic outcomes, a series of academic outcomes, and it also matters for psychological and physical well-being. So I just want you to hold the idea that school climate is important. It's just kind of messy, and immigrant kids are missing in it. So that set my colleagues and I on the mission of trying to figure out, well, what can we learn, and can we do some, collect some data to test our, a model of, does school climate matter for immigrant kids, and in what ways, for what outcomes? So working with a colleague at Reimagining Migration and with Youth Truth, we were able to add items that allowed us to know whether or not a student was born abroad or not, and whether their parents were or not. And so our research questions were, do students from distinct generations of immigrant backgrounds, the first, the second, and third generation, report different perceptions of teacher relationships and psychological safety? These are, there are many other, potential pieces, but this is what we were able to pull from our available data. So teacher relationships and psychological safety. And then, do these dimensions predict school belonging? This very important concept. And then, does school belonging mediate outcomes like academic engagement, academic challenge, and mental health? So that was the model we wanted to test. Very nerdy, I'm sorry, but I want to kind of engage you in why this might matter, and what evidence other than just anecdotal qualitative data, which, by the way, I love qualitative data, love it. I've always, engaged in it, but sometimes you just need more than that to persuade folks. So we were able to collect data from 8 schools in different places in the country, 3,000 plus students. And let me now show you the conceptual model that we assessed. That's what it looks like. So all those words that I had on the other screen, this is what it looks like visually. This is what we were assessing. And so now, punchline, what did we learn? So here's what we learned. We learned that first generation students, our model, it worked. Bottom line, our model held the test of, structural equation modeling. So basically what we learned is that first generation students report more negative school climates, in the sense that they had reported less positive teacher relationships and less school safety. We also learned that these dimensions, these 2 dimensions of positive teacher relationships and school safety, were negatively associated with school belonging. Not surprising, but the model held. And that in turn, school belonging mediated academic motivation and emotional well-being. So this is not just an abstract idea that teachers kind of feel is important. It really does matter. First generation, the newcomer kids are not having the same experience as third generation kids. And it matters for important outcomes, is the bottom line. And so this is a kind of call, and I want to, a couple more things I want to say. As we were doing this work, we encountered tremendous resistance in gathering the data. So we were giving free access to a $2,000, what schools usually have to pay $2,000 for this fancy, measure. Nobody wanted to participate. We really had a devil of a time getting participation. Lots and lots of resistances. Some of it might have been pandemic fatigue. Some of it, was that we were, Panorama kind of dominates the field and we were using another, measure. But I really, as in conversations, it's the I word. The I word is now, the L word, no, the I word. Immigration is a worrisome word in the field of education. It's avoided. So we found that access was really an issue. And we did a second round after the data I just showed you was 2 years ago. A year ago, we did it again. And we again had a lot of resistance in getting folks to participate. And what we ended up with is only schools that had a particularly high climate, a particularly good climate. So only only schools that knew that they were going to look good let us in. So that is kind of interesting. So there are tremendous sampling challenges to doing this kind of work. And, I'm past the point of ever needing to publish another paper ever again in the rest of my life. So I'm not in it for the data. What I'm in it for is we need to, to let the world know that, immigrant kids are probably having a different experience. We need, 20 years ago, GLSEN collected data that showed that LGBTQ plus kids were having a different experience in schools. And that shifted the dialogue. Services began to appear for these kids. I mean, is it all better for everybody? No, but it is better. Things shifted. I'm old enough to know that there's been a shift. So if we don't measure, we will never know. So schools need to start realizing that across the country, 26% of all kids are of immigrant origin. And in places like California, New York, Florida, Texas, it's many more. It's a much higher percentage. We need to, schools need to not play ostrich on this and recognize who's getting, who's having different kinds of climates. And it's to diagnose the student experience, to identify which groups might be more at risk at certain times. During COVID, Asian kids were being targeted. Now Muslim kids, in the climate that we're going in, if we go into another administration that is going to be particularly anti-Latine, we're going to see more of that go up. So we need to be capturing that. And we also, if we're going to be doing interventions that are trying to target improving climate, we need a pre-test and a post-test. And if we don't know, if we don't measure, we can't find out. So this is my new obsession. It's very nerdy, I'm sorry, but it parallels the extraordinary work that you all are doing. And, I'm hoping that I will stimulate interest and passion in districts across the country to do this very important work. And I will pass on recommendations for now. The slides will be available. I think we should go into conversation now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carola. And thank you again to Anisha and Jessica. I think we have a perfect question to sort of kick off that conversation. And if we can stop sharing slides, we can feature all our panelists. Right after our initial presentation from Jessica, we got the following question, which I'm just going to put into the chat. So it's essentially, how do you recommend navigating the line between including students and avoiding segregation whenever possible? And the widespread success of standalone Newcomer programs, such as those described in your book, talking to Jessica, which have the appearance of segregation. I would love to maybe go Jessica, Monisha, Carola, in that this really touches all of your work, and it is a fascinating question.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've taken away from traveling across the country and looking at best practices and reading so much of the literature is that there are many strategies that work, and it really depends on the community of students. So take, for example, the Global Village Project, this very small, very specific program that is dedicated to refugee girls who spent a long time out of school. There are real benefits to creating that community because those students are often not being served. they're either being told they should not enter school at all, or if they are entering, being ignored and out of the back of the classroom, so dropping out at really high rates. And so there are real advantages to creating a program that specifically serves them. In other communities, there might be advantages to have a totally different program. And so I think what I've found is that there are lots of great strategies. What I find in some schools, so to Corolla's point of like the schools that are more hostile or oblivious to immigrant students, is that many immigrant students are sitting in the back of the classroom, and so are segregated, though not technically segregated. And so I am for programs that work well, whether those are programs where kiddos like the Internationals Network, there are so many like them, where it does look like it's a segregated program, or programs that you have kids their families have been in the country for multiple generations and newcomer kiddos, but that are actively working to support all kiddos and actively working to sort of have kids see each other as a common community with shared strengths and each bringing strengths into the classroom. That would be my quick take on that.
Yeah, I can jump in. For our book, we also had like dozens of schools that we give examples from. And the reason we highlight them is because we think they're working well and they're all different. So there's dozens that we talk about, and then there are 4 kind of in-depth school profiles. One is Lincoln High School in Nebraska, which newcomers are integrated entirely. There's no standalone program for them. It's, very much integrated into a larger comprehensive high school that I think had over 2,000 kids at the high school. And so it's an example of how you in a large comprehensive high school still make spaces so that the needs of newcomers can be met. And there's after school clubs, there's different programs, there's a job fair that's multilingual that families can participate in, all kinds of interesting programs that they're doing. And then we have examples of Internationals Network schools that are, more separated. There, one school that we talk about in the book, it's not one of the profiles, but we visited and did interviews and included in some of the strategy chapters is Richmond Internationals Academy, which is one part of a larger comprehensive high school. So the students participate in that academy, students who are newcomers, and as they get more proficient in English, they can take electives and other classes with students from across the high school who are home language English speakers, and they can do PE together, and there's other opportunities through music for them even while they're in the academy to participate with students in other schools. So there are so many models. I think really thinking about, for us, the framework was of caring and humanizing. And there's so many models in which if you have that perspective, they can work. I don't think there's one size fits all. It's about what the context is, what the district has capacity for, but we just know historically and presently how many newcomers are not served by being, like Jessica saying, sitting in the back of the classroom, being ignored, not having their specific needs being attended to. So I do agree that there is that critique, and I think sometimes you need to separate in order to empower and affirm and engage and provide tailored resources to a population that needs more than some of the other populations in a district or in a school.
What Manisha and Jessica said. But, absolutely, I agree with both of you. And, I think what you need you need faculty and staff that understand these kids, that have some basic training in what to do, and you need the caring and the frame of mind to do this work. So you need to take a whole child approach to these students. You need to have basic strategies of education in place. And I don't think it matters if it's, segregated for a little while and then transitioned, or whether it's, from the beginning integrated. I think one of the issues that happens when students are in a standalone program for a while and then are moved into another is that the transition is often really rough, really rough. The baton is not turned over gently. And in our longitudinal study of 400 kids, we saw this real drop in performance with kids as they made that transition, because they went out of the caring bubble to this rather either oblivious or hostile spaces. And so that's one of the things that I worry about in, if it's not a thoughtful transition, then, it's not our son was profoundly dyslexic. And, it's like, it's a little bit like kids with learning differences. You can, if you segregate them for a while and you don't make that transition, well, it can be really hard on them. You need to, it's scaffolded. It should be scaffolded.
Well, that just makes me think, Corolla, also about the necessity for really building out post-secondary pathways, because even if we have a whole high school career in a really good newcomer high school, you transition to no bubble. And that can be just as bad as that mid-high school transition. But what I heard from everyone is really that thorough theme of like, it can be any number of things, but it needs to be intentionality in programming, in staffing, in materials.
And training. Yeah.
And training.
And caring,
Training
that sort of baseline caring.
Yes. The caring and belonging sort of undergirds everything, without which it doesn't matter. I'm going to go to a next question. And I think this could be interpreted a number of different ways. I've also put a feedback survey into the chat if you feel like doing that during. Terry asks, how do you differentiate between a culture of belonging versus a culture of learning? And I think, there's a lot to unpack there. And there's that question of how do they reinforce each other, or how can one sometimes be weaponized against the other, or it looks like, Corolla, you had a reaction right away. Take the floor.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all. I don't see them as mutually exclusive at all. I think that belongingness allows folks to be in their full learning selves. And not everybody has the same need to be. I mean, I actually think if you think of Maslow, belonging is right there in the center of, a need. So I actually think you can't really learn if you're feeling excluded. It's tough. If you're getting messages of you don't belong, you're not smart enough, you are less than, really, really hard to be at your optimal learning self. I think that I just think that's a fundamental foundation for optimal learning. And some kids are more into needing that than others. But you just have to create that space from the beginning, in my humble opinion.
And Crystal, would you mind putting up the final slide as maybe we take a couple more answers or thoughts from Manisha and Jessica? Folks, if you have the time to fill out a little feedback survey for us, it really helps us keep sharing this great content and elevating great presenters. And in the meantime, I want to ask Manisha, Jessica, how do you feel about that sort of question of learning versus belonging, or how do you differentiate?
I would just repeat what Corolla said. I think that belonging is I'm thinking, and this was a case that was in the news, and that Jane Pack, who is the co-executive director of Refugee and Immigrant Transitions, who I think was on one of the previous webinars, and I think she might be here today in the audience, and is a wonderful colleague and former doctoral student of mine. We often talk about the incident of the kid, I think it was in Missouri, the Afghan boy who was resettled, his family was resettled, and there was like no Muslim communities for miles and miles around, no teacher really checking in with this child, completely isolated, completely bullied. This child committed suicide, and there's a whole ProPublica piece on it that details sort of like the whole way that this went down, and what does it mean to be told that you don't belong and nobody is checking for you or caring about your existence, to the point that you are so dehumanized in a context. Where's the learning that could have happened? Where's the learning for the others in that context? And so I do think belonging is a precondition for learning. Maybe some people who feel isolated and bullied can still learn, but I don't even think that's an authentic form of learning that they're engaging in from that situation. So I think that both of them have to go together. And to me, belonging is creating a space where students and educators and staff feel that they belong is essential for any meaningful learning to take place.
I'd second both. I see it every day in my classroom. If we're creating communities where our kids feel safe, feel secure, feel valued, feel that they have a voice, then they're going to be invested in that space. They're going to want to learn in that space. They're going to feel that their voice matters. And the learning is going to be so much stronger. I was pulling from Corolla what you were saying of how belonging impacts learning outcomes and how important that is. And I see it too, just right in the classroom. And so I just completely echo everything that's been said, that clearly kids can learn without that sense of belonging, but they're doing that despite all of the things that are pulling back what they could be achieving. So I think if we want to see the best success for our students, we really need to be investing in ensuring that our students belong in our schools, in our communities.
Can I just add one tiny point to that? So when I showed that model, belongingness was important for all kids. So belongingness predicted mediated all of those outcomes for all kids. It didn't matter whether you're first, second, or third generation. So the model held for all. So, this is a reminder that immigrant kids are not from the moon. They are kids. All kids need belonging. All kids needed belonging. And immigrant kids are going through this transition. They're coming into a new space. They're getting messages, you don't really belong, from the outside world. And, kids aren't always nice to each other, by the way, so it's particularly under attack. So for that reason, belongingness is just all the more essential to foster in our learning communities so that everyone can learn.
So we've got a strongly unanimous panel on belonging as a prerequisite. And I think, Corolla, you had mentioned maybe it was earlier before the webinar, how sometimes we focus too narrowly on just linguistic assets and learning for newcomers. And of all learning, I think the effective filter for language acquisition is maybe the most important across disciplines. So that really resonates. I want to thank our panelists and speakers so much. Thank you, Corolla. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Manisha, for sharing your knowledge with us. To everyone who's here, thank you so much for sharing the space with us. By Monday, we'll send out a follow-up email with a recording of the webinar and those nice links that our panelists brought for us. And have a great weekend, and until next time.
An honor and a pleasure. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.